الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى نبينا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه أجمعين. اللهم إنا نسألك علما نافعا ورزقا طيبا وعملا متقبلا. اللهم فقهنا في الدين وعلمنا التأويل يا رب العالمين. So yesterday we covered the chapter of how to give zakat on your merchandise, on business merchandise. Today, inshallah, we will cover the chapter on Babu Ikhraj al-Zakat, how to pay your zakat. And this chapter will cover the rulings on if you're allowed to pay it early or late, and a little bit about if you pay it to someone that is not valid, or if your wealth is destroyed after you pay it, and you've paid earlier, what are the rulings behind that? So the author, rahimahullah, he starts off by saying, لا يجوز تأخير الزكاة عن وقت وجوبها إذا أمكن إخراجها. He says, rahimahullah, it is not permissible to delay the paying of your zakat when it becomes mandatory, when it becomes wajib. إذا أمكن إخراجها, if you are able to pay it. If you are able to pay. So we were speaking about this mas'ala of paying your zakah once every year, and we mentioned previously that it needs to be the lunar year, because if we calculate in the solar year, in the miladi year, right, which is the one that we go by, January, February, March, etc. If we choose one day and we use our hawl for that, there will be it exceeds the lunar year by about 5 to 10 days, depending on the year, right? So it will be more than the lunar year, meaning that you will pay your zakat late. And as we know, it is not permissible to pay your zakat late if you are able to pay your zakat. So now, how is it possible that a person is not able to pay his zakat? For example, if a person, he has a piece of land, and the land is worth, maybe $1 million, but he does not have that amount of money to pay for the land, to pay the zakat for the land, right? If it's worth $1 million, he would have to pay $2,500 in zakat if he purchased the land with the intent of selling it for a higher price, right? Because it would be considered as urud al-tijara. It would be considered like merchandise, where you buy it and you sell it, so it would be considered as that. Now, if he, for example, he purchases the land and he gets stuck with it. He tries to sell it, for example. He puts it in the market, but no one is buying it. No one buys the land. He's stuck with this land, right? What does he do? In that case, he can wait until he sells the land, and then after he sells the land, he pays the amount of zakat that is due. So if, for example, he sells the land after 5 or 6 years, then he will have to pay for 5 or 6 years on the zakat that is due. فإن فعل فتلف المال لم تسقط عنه الزكاة وإن تلف قبله سقط. And then he, rahimahullah, he says that if the time for zakat comes and then his property is ruined, so something happens to his property, right? Maybe he has $10,000 in cash. The time for zakat comes and his money gets destroyed. Someone steals it after that, maybe a month after that. He hasn't paid his zakat yet. He's late. Does he still have to pay zakat? And the answer is yes, because he was able to pay zakat at the time it was due. That means he must pay, even if his money gets destroyed or his wealth gets destroyed afterwards, he has to repay that zakat because it was wajib on him at that time. وَإِن تَلِفَ قَبْلَهُ سَقَطَتْ. And if his wealth was destroyed before the time of zakat that was mandatory, so before the wujub of zakat, then his zakat is revoked. He does not have to pay for that zakat because at the time when it's due, he does not have that money that he needs to pay zakat on. وَيَجُوزُ تَأْجِيلُهَا إِذَا كَمُلَ النِّصَابُ وَلَا يَجُوزُ قَبْلَ ذَلك. And it is permissible to pay your it is permissible to pay your zakat early if your nisab has been reached, and is not permissible before that. So for example, if you would like to pay in advance for 2 years or 3 years, you can pay. It is permissible to give your zakat for 2 years in advance, right, or more or less. The opinion of the majority of the scholars is that it is permissible to give it within 2 years in advance. 2 years in advance. So if you want to pay your zakat 2 years in advance, you have to make sure that you have the nisab at least for the zakat, and then you can pay 2 years in advance. And sometimes you may want to pay in advance because you may see a person that is in need, and maybe he has a huge family, or he's in need for a lot of money, maybe to get out of debt, or some sort of issue that he's facing, and he needs a lot of money, right? And you say you want to help him out, you want to pay your zakat early, right? So you say, okay, 1 year's worth of zakat will not suffice for this person. Let me give him 2 years, right? And then that will suffice, and then you don't have to pay the next year. So that is permissible. However, if you don't have the nisab, if the money that you have, for example, is $200, right, or $300 in savings, and it does not reach the nisab, then you cannot pay. You cannot pay for more than 1 year in advance. You cannot pay for the zakat in advance. وإن عجلها إلى غير مستحقها لم تجزئه وإن صار عند الوجوب من أهلها وإن دفعها إلى مستحقها فمات أو استغنى أو ارتد أجزأت وإن تلف المال لم يرجع على الآخر. So the author rahimahullah, he says, if a person pays earlier than it is due to someone who is not eligible for it, it will not count, even if the person becomes eligible at the time it is due. So for example, you have a friend and he's going to get married, and he's going to get married at the end of the year, right? Right now, he has money, he's okay, he doesn't need zakat. But at the end of the year, he knows that he's going to get married. And as we know, marriage, it takes up a lot of money sometimes. Maybe he has to purchase a house, maybe he has to purchase a car, he has to give mahar, right? He's going to be in need, right? He's going to be in need at the end of the year. You give him zakat now, at this time, and then at the end of the year, or at the end of at the end of the next year, when your zakat is wajib, when it is due, he is in need. If you give him now, and at this time when you give him your zakat, he is not in need, then your zakat will not be valid. He has to be in need when you give him right now. Another example would be, for example, someone, his employer notifies him, his employer notifies him that he will lose his job, he will be laid off after 2 months. Right now he's good, but after 2 months he will be jobless, and most likely you think he will be in need, right? And you give your zakat to him now, then it will not be valid. He has to be in the situation that he needs zakat, or he qualifies for zakat at the time you are giving him. Even if you give, for example, 2 years in advance, and at the second year he is in need at that time, your zakat will still not count, because the person needs to be from Ahl al-Zakah, from the people of Zakah, at the time when you are giving the zakat. Then rahimahullah, he says that if one pays it early to someone who deserves it, then that person dies, no longer needs it, or becomes an apostate. So if you pay your zakat early, and then the person dies, for example, or he doesn't need it anymore, or he leaves Islam, right? So you've paid him 2 years in advance, right? And these things happen. What happens? Do you take back your money or not? And the author rahimahullah says that your zakat will be counted. It is counted. You do not need to take your money back. However, if his property is ruined after he paid the zakat, he cannot ask for it back from the person who he received it. So, for example, you paid your zakat, right, for 2 years in advance. Now, 1 year passes by, and you become in need. Your property is ruined. All of your wealth is destroyed, right? And you realize you think about it. You're like, listen, I actually paid in advance, right? I paid zakat in advance. Do you go back to those fuqara, those poor, or whoever you paid it to, and ask them that I actually qualify for zakat now, or I'm actually in need of my money, and I paid you in advance. Actually, let me take my money back. No, you cannot do that. وقال المصنف, and then the author rahimahullah, he goes on to say, ولا تنقل الصدقة إلى بلد تقصر إليه الصلاة إلا أن لا تجد من يأخذها في بلدها. So the author rahimahullah, and this is particular to the Hanbali madhab, he says that your sadaqah or your zakah should not be sent to another country or another city where you will have to, if you travel to that, you will shorten your salah. So that is the distance where you are allowed to give your zakat to. So you should be giving your zakat at home, right where you are, where you're living. And then he gives an exception, illa, except if you do not find any people in your hometown to give the zakat to, then you can send your money elsewhere. And we'll end off here, inshallah. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Tomorrow we will discuss who the recipients of zakat are. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.